Tensura What If? Silver Timeline by CBCTEBAS Chapter 83 Friction. I see. Rimuru muttered as the flood of memories returned to him. He now understood everything, why it happened, who did it, and how they managed to do it. Every detail was laid bare, stark and unflinching. He rose from his spot, his movements slow and deliberate, and turned to face the others. Raphael. I think Lucia had an ultimate skill like that. His voice was heavy with realization as he walked back toward Femina and the others. They stood still, their expressions a mix of anticipation and concern, waiting for Rimuru's command. A boss, barely conscious, was leaning heavily against Lendi. Lord Rimuru, my apologies, Lendi began, his voice strained. I couldn't fulfill my mission of. Rimuru raised a hand, a silent command for him to stop. His gaze shifted from the trio to the pink-haired baby who was giggling and reaching out to him, her tiny arms outstretched, seeking to be carried. Understanding Rimuru's unspoken wish, Femina gently placed Milam into his arms. Leave us for now, Rimuru instructed, his voice laden with grief that he no longer bothered to conceal. The trio bowed and retreated to the citadel as quietly as they could, leaving Rimuru and Milam alone. Rimuru sank onto the grassy ground, his posture weary as he sat cross-legged, cradling Milam as if she were the most precious thing in existence. The pet dragon snuggles quietly near his feet. He slowly pets the creature as his palm trails over the dragon's small body. It's in here, huh? With his muttering, he absorbed something from the pet dragon and into his palm coursing through his body. The cool breeze rustled through the grass, a stark contrast to the storm of emotions swirling within him. In his arms, baby Milam cooed softly. Her tiny fingers clung to the fabric of his robe, and her innocent blue eyes, so reminiscent of her father's, stared up at him with a mixture of trust and curiosity. Rimuru's expression twisted with pain as he looked down at her, the weight of guilt and sorrow bearing down on him. Gently, he rocked Milam, his mind overwhelmed by memories of Veldanava and Lucia, dear friends he should have never left behind. I'm so sorry, Milam, he whispered, his voice barely audible, choked with emotion. I couldn't save them. I wasn't there. His forehead pressed gently against hers as he murmured, I should have been there for them. Milam gurgled softly, her tiny hand reaching up to touch his cheek, sensing perhaps the sorrow that enveloped him. Rimuru managed a sad smile, placing a tender kiss on her forehead. I promise, I'll protect you with everything I have. Hee. Nearing a complete soul made me this emotional. Guess I know where those emotions went, Rimuru said with a hollow laugh, marveling at how he had broken down in this manner. He frowned as he recalled the fragment he had absorbed, musing, that fragment held such intense emotions. More like, isn't he mentally insane? With Toru's consumption, Rimuru had discovered that the devoured soul contained more than a few hundred to 1,000 souls, each imbued with malice and other negative emotions, fear, sorrow, and more. The original owner of the body had struggled under the strain of these voices, leading to the creation of multiple personalities born from his instinct to maintain rationality. By integrating these souls, the original had managed to forge personalities that could handle the immense pressure and ensure his survival. As Rimuru held Milam close, Velgrin stepped out of a gate, her presence a sudden, comforting warmth in the cold, tense atmosphere. She took in the scene before her, Rimuru, her lover, holding the child of her brother and sister-in-law, his face etched with deep grief. Velgrin's heart sank with fear at the sight. She approached quietly, her footsteps soft against the ground. Seeing Rimuru's somber expression and the baby nestled in his arms, she spoke gently, her voice tinged with concern. Rimuru, what happened? Her tone seemed to offer solace, a silent plea for Rimuru to find the courage to share the harrowing truth. Rimuru looked up, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. They're gone, Velgrind. Veldanava and Lucia. I couldn't save them. Velgrin's eyes widened in shock, her breath catching in her throat. No. I was on my way to help. I thought I could make it in time. Her voice cracked, and she reached out, her trembling fingers touching Rimuru's arm. Tears welled up and began to spill down her cheeks as she hugged Rimuru from behind, her embrace a mix of seeking comfort and offering it. The only sounds in the quiet moment were Velgrin's sobs and Milam's soft mumblings. Suddenly, Rudra stormed in, followed by Guy and Velzard. Rudra's eyes locked onto Rimuru with palpable rage. They had intended to visit Veldanava and Lucia in the city, but upon arrival, they found it in ruins. The city was devastated, its residents scattered and dead, including creatures resembling harpies they did not recognize. Assuming these were the bodies of the assailants, they had rushed to Veldanava's home. The sight that greeted them etched despair into their hearts. Veldanava and Lucia lay on the ground, their bodies heavily injured, their souls departed, leaving behind lifeless forms. Rudra fell to the ground, kneeling as his anguished cries echoed through the desolate city. His shouts of vengeance rang out, promising that those responsible would suffer a fate worse than death. Guy and Velzard stood behind him. Guy looked away, his teeth clenched, while Velzard, tearful, held a hand over her mouth, silently mourning their loss. Rimuru, what happened? Why? Why Veldanava and Lucia? Rudra demanded, his voice shaking with a mix of anger and dread. Rimuru stood and handed Milam to Velgrind, who clung to her tearfully as she left his embrace. Rimuru's voice trembled as he replied, "They're dead, Rudra. I couldn't do anything. I was not there at the time. Milam was the only one I could save." His voice broke, and a tear rolled down his cheek. Rudra's face contorted with a mixture of anger and grief. "You let them die? You were supposed to protect them." His voice rose to a shout, raw with emotion. His rage flared as he unleashed his power, the energy crackling around him. Velgrind stepped forward, her eyes blazing with defiance and sorrow. "Rudra, I was on my way too. None of us made it in time." She wiped away a tear that had slipped down her cheek, her voice firm yet laden with grief. She sought to lessen the blame on Rimuru, knowing well that none of them had been present when it happened. Rudra's fury was relentless. He grabbed Rimuru by the collar, lifting him off the ground with a violent shake. "You were there, Rimuru. You were supposed to be their shield." His grip was tight, his eyes wild with grief and rage. Velgrind pushed Rudra back with a forceful shove, making him release Rimuru. "Enough, Rudra. Blaming him won't bring them back." Her voice was fierce, yet her eyes were filled with pain. The cries of Milam grew louder as the tension mounted, her distress palpable. Rudra's eyes blazed with fury. "Stay out of this, Velgrind. This is between me and him." He turned back to Rimuru, his anger unabated. Velgrind turned to Guy and Velzard, seeking their help in restraining Rudra's rampage. Guy and Velzard remained silent and neutral, much to Velgrind's frustration. She made a parallel existence to hold Milam while the other rushed to Rimuru's side. Velgrind stood her ground, her voice sharp and cutting through the tension. "No, it's not. You're just looking for someone to blame because you weren't there yourself." Her words cut deep, resonating not only with Rudra but also with Guy and Velzard, who chose to bottle up their emotions rather than confronting the painful truth. Rudra snarled, pushing Velgrind aside. "Don't you dare lecture me. Rimuru was supposed to be the one protecting them. He volunteered, remember? The city is his. The subordinates are his, and he failed." His voice cracked, revealing the depth of his anguish. Rimuru winced at Rudra's words, the harsh accusations echoing in his mind as a reminder of the tragedy that had befallen the creator and his wife. Regaining his composure, Rimuru tried to intervene. "Both of you, stop this." His voice was quiet, almost pleading. Rudra's anger reached a boiling point. He shoved Rimuru to the ground, standing over him. "You don't belong in the cardinal world, Rimuru. You've caused enough damage. Leave, and never return." His voice was a venomous whisper. "You have your work, right? Why don't you start minding your own business and get out?" Guy finally stepped in, his voice steady but firm. "Rudra, that's going too far." Concern darkened his eyes. He had never seen his friend so consumed by rage. The loss of his sister and friend had clearly shattered his mental state. Rudra shook his head, resolute. "No, I stand by this. You're saying you don't believe he is to blame for their deaths, after taking full responsibility?" His glare silenced any retort Guy might have had. Velgrind, her anger and frustration mounting, lunged at Rudra. The two clashed, their powers flaring in a violent dance of light and energy. "You're being unreasonable, Rudra," she shouted, her attacks driven by a mix of anger and deep despair. Rudra deflected her strikes, his face a mask of rage and sorrow. You think I care? He let them die. His voice was broken, every word a dagger in his own heart. Guy and Velzard moved swiftly to separate them. With combined strength, they pulled Velgrind away from Rudra. Velzard's gaze was cold and distant as she turned away, her voice barely a whisper. I have nothing to say. Her words were heavy with unspoken grief. She felt the weight of the situation but couldn't bring herself to voice her thoughts. Rimuru looked around, feeling the crushing weight of their judgment. I won't do that, Rudra. I have as much right to come and go here as anyone else. His voice was quiet, but beneath it was a steely determination. Velgrind placed a comforting hand on Rimuru's shoulder, her touch gentle and filled with love. Rimuru. Her voice was soothing, a stark contrast to the turmoil around them. Rimuru held her hand and began to open a gate. I will let you take care of Milam, but I will leave a parallel of myself. Other than that, I won't be visiting often, that I can assure you. Velgrind bit her lip, her eyes conflicted but resolute. She handed Milam and the pet dragon to Velzard, who took the child with a somber nod, and followed Rimuru. As they turned to leave, Rimuru cast one last glance over his shoulder. With a subtle gesture, he left a parallel existence behind, a version of himself that will remain in this world as assurance for everything. Velgrind doing the same, as the two parallels scanned the surrounding. The parallels would then use transport magic to leave the area for somewhere else. Rimuru and Velgrind walked away, leaving behind the sorrow and accusations. The gate closed behind them, sealing off the scene of grief and conflict. Rudra watched them go, his face a canvas of unresolved rage and despair. The echoes of his shouted accusations lingered in the empty space, a haunting reminder of the pain and loss that had driven him to this point. Guy and Velzard stood silently, their expressions reflecting the heavy toll of the day's events. I just wanted Veldanava to feel reassured, to accept us. Rudrick killed his heart, knowing that his lamentations could no longer be heard. All that was left was ideal that had lost its purpose. You still want to do this? Guy talked to him, his hand on the hero's shoulder. Yes. All I have left is this game with you. Your approval is the only thing I have left. All right then. I'll keep playing with you. In the distance, the ruined city remained a silent witness to the tragedy that had unfolded, a stark reminder of the high cost of failure and the deep bonds that had been severed. We will now start the 2000 years in the cardinal world. We will be focusing on the parallel existence from now on. The main body will take a backseat and let him handle the threat outside. This Rimuru is more compassionate. More like future, original Rimuru, but rational and realistic after having seen his subordinates die. You can think of him like the hypothetical Veldora. If he died, where he can remember Rimuru but the attachment isn't there. It is just a bunch of memories with no real feelings for the people in the memory. Fun fact: this chapter was supposed to be named Banishment, and the story would focus on the parallel, Toru, who will be the new main character. But this plot was scratched out, and we now have Rimuru, who is more like the original and a parallel Velgrind staying in the world.